Hello dear viewer, welcome to part 2 of my analysis on the monsters and bosses of Cry of Fear and what they represent, plus general information on them. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I advise you go back and watch that first. But otherwise, much like last time, heavy topics warning for the stuff ahead. And with that, now to get straight back into it, this white section which I showed last video being what we're going to focus on. Starting at the top left we have the citalopram, which is functionally the same as the Crazy Runner, albeit are only found in the maintenance tunnels in the subway levels, in exclusively the single player campaign. Regarding its relevance to Simon, citalopram is a drug used to treat depression, likely prescribed to Simon by Dr Purnell, but as I mentioned in my video talking about Simon, it's very likely the citalopram medication had the reverse effect of what it was supposed to do, which is a real world documented thing in those who take it. It works for some people and does the exact opposite in others. But yeah, with that's the citalopram. Moving on to our next enemy, the drowned. These creatures themselves have no physical attack unless the player gets too close, at which point a baby will burst out from its stomach and attack you with a knife. Albeit the primary attack of the drowned, if the player is exposed to her presence for too long, with at least one bullet available for your weapons, the screen will shake and darken with Simon starting to panic, followed by the creature forcing you to put the gun to your head to try and make you kill yourself. At which point you have to rapidly press the left mouse button to resist its influence. If you're successful in resisting the creature, the screen goes back to normal and Simon will cry a little bit after. In regards to how you deal with the drowned, pistol whipping it with an empty magazine is effective, albeit the baby inside will emerge and attack with a similar rate to the citalopram or Crazy Runner. But the creature's slow speed makes dodging back and getting away from it fairly easy. Also, they have the ability to attack in between the door-off sections of the same map, such as the subway for example, so if you're in those kind of areas it's best to just kill them and get them out of the way. Also, if you're holding a melee weapon, its suicidal influence attack has no effect. But anyway, in regards to its relevance to Simon, the suicidal influence ability this enemy possesses is a reflection of Simon's own temptations to end his own life, and its name, the Drowned, could be in reference to how Simon feels like he's drowning in his own misery. Albeit why a baby bursts out of its stomach to attack you, I have no idea. Possibly an abstract way of representing Simon's growing insanity and how it's hurting him, specifically from within, but that feels like a stretch. Anyway, moving on to the next enemy, the Flygar. These creatures are encountered in single player and co-op and doctor mode, specifically after exiting Gustav Park and heading to Waspic Gardens. Flygar is the only flying monster, if you're not counting Carcass because that's a boss fight, across the entire game, and it has two ways of attacking. The first being with the scissors it's holding, and the second being an acidic projectile. Overall, it's recommended to just evade this enemy in open areas, but if you're forced to battle one in an enclosed space like the subway station, they are ridiculously devious, as the enclosed space makes it harder to evade them, and they have a higher chance of hitting you with their ranged attacks. Albeit you can easily kill them with one shot with the hunting rifle, and it's also worth noting that there's a cooldown period between attacks, and the creature's head will begin to spasm before it launches its projectile, which is a good visual cue of it preparing a ranged attack, allowing you to sidestep the oncoming shot. Regarding specifically where you encounter it, it spawns in a few set locations. After exiting Gustav Park, in Waspic Gardens after digging up the key to the apartment entrance, in both Saxon Avenue and Hanson Square subway stations, the Flygars spawning in after completing certain tasks, in Kirkville near the end of the game, albeit only a few of them, and in Doctor Mode they appear on Preston Road, around 7 of them, as well as in front of the apartments. With that, now to cover the relevancy to Simon. They are most likely supposed to represent his growing insanity, as well as his crippled state. A common tactic used on insane asylum patients a long time ago was to restrain them to their beds, so these things could represent how Simon views he's going to end up, the floating bed being how these creatures get around. Definitely a nod to Simon's wheelchair-bound state. The creature's hands are also bleeding and there's various slits and cuts, which is definitely related to Simon's self-harm. And with that, that's the Flygar. Moving on to the next enemy, we have the Hanger. These ones are not even actual monsters, they're more an environmental hazard than anything, encountered in the forest area in single player and in co-op. A warning sign before you enter the area saying watch out for the trees. But anyway, they let out horrific screams and drop from random trees with nooses tied around their necks, and if you pass under them when they fall, they'll deal damage to you. And they're also seen in chapter 8, hanging from literally nowhere. But regarding their relevance to Simon, they pretty much just represent his urge to kill himself. Albeit why it's a woman, I don't know. Or in a more abstract way, they could represent how Simon feels like he's killed his relationship with Sophie. Albeit that's all there really is to say about them. With that, now to move on to the next enemy, the Hangman. These worm-headed, tortured, upside-down burrito men are completely invincible and instantly kill you if they touch you, and are faced during a nightmare sequence at the end of chapter 4. These things will pursue you relentlessly, albeit not of their own free will, as they're being moved around by a track system on the ceiling. The maze you encounter them in having 3 hangmen in total, but overall gameplay wise, you can only run from them or avoid them, and they exist more or less to just be an obstacle. But anyway, regarding their relevance to Simon, while they most likely represent his crippled state and his failing mental health, they could also represent how Simon feels stuck, and like he has no control over what's happening. And with that, now to move on to the next enemy, the Psycho. These creatures are very hard to dodge melee attacks, being the second fastest attacking monster, the first one being the crawling faceless mentioned in the previous video. These creatures usually hide in dark corners and wait for you to pass by and then ambush you, which combined with their attack speed and damage, makes them exceedingly dangerous. It's recommended that if you're going to go against one, just put lead in it rather than try and use melee, because you're very likely going to get yourself killed. When killed, the Psycho will drop his axe, albeit it can't be picked up. It also wears the same clothes as the Suicider, and very interestingly, the Psycho does not make any noise at all until the player looks at it, which triggers them to run at you and attack. Regarding their relevancy to Simon, the creatures hiding in dark corners could represent how Simon feels completely alone, but the way they attack when looked at could represent Simon's growing bitterness, and his desire to lash out at other people, which makes sense as in the worst ending, Simon wanted to take as many people as he could with him, but being in a wheelchair made that impossible. And with that, that's the Psycho. Moving on to the next enemy, we have the Saw Crazy. It instantly kills you if it touches you and has 150 health, this creature being exclusive to co-op, found in the main co-op campaign, the Manhunt campaign, and the Suicide maps, the creature being a mix of Crazy Runner and Saw Runner, and at one point it appeared in single player only to be quickly removed, being found on the narrow pathway between the TL Trading building and a door towards the apartments where Sophie is encountered, prior to its removal, albeit in the official co-op campaign this thing appears 5 times. First in Kirkville at the very beginning, after you exit the parking garage. Second is at the beginning of the forest segment, in an abandoned shack, specifically in a room stocked with weapons. Third is in the asylum on the 2nd floor. Fourth is in the lower levels of the subway, upon reaching the city, where you battle it alongside several Suiciders, and the 5th fight is in the tight halls of the TL Trading building on the lower floor. Regarding its relevance to Simon, however, due to it also killing other enemies that are around it, it could possibly represent Simon's hatred of those around him, but considering its quick removal from single player, I don't think it's all too related to Simon himself. Albeit if it is connected to him, it probably represents more than just his hatred. In addition to that, it represents his indifference and anger towards everyone else. And with that, moving on to the next enemy, we have the iconic Saw Runner. Being attacked by him is an instant kill if he manages to land a hit, and he has 2000 health on all difficulties, and he's encountered in a few places in single player. The first is in the alleyways of Ronald Street, the second is when you traverse back through the alleyways towards the college. Third encounter is during the nightmare sequence in the roped off room, the fourth is in the forest segment, and the fifth is in the Kirkville sewers. These 5 all being exclusive to single player, albeit he appears 3 times in Doctor mode, the first in a network of corridors after exiting the sewers, second is in the basement of the apartment building, and the third final encounter is in the hallway of the 3rd floor of the apartments, albeit in co-op he only appears twice. The first is in the exact same location he's met in the forest segment of single player, and the second final confrontation was added in 1.2, in which he'll appear one more time in the alleyways where Simon first met him. In both encounters you're forced to kill him and you can't run away from him, due to an unbreakable blockade at the end of the alleyway. Albeit when it comes to dealing with the Saw Runner there's a few tactics. First is stay calm and simply walk, only sprint or dodge when he is directly behind you. This is because the Saw Runner has to stop to actually attack. Secondly, if you've unlocked a camera you can just freeze him in place to give yourself some breathing room. Thirdly, for the forest encounter, it's pretty easy to lose his line of sight by simply turning left and right. Fourthly, he cannot hit you directly when you are moving. Fifthly, keep clear of dead ends. And sixthly, he cannot be stunned like most other monsters in the game, so simply just don't waste your mind trying to. The best thing to do is just escape him quickly. However, if you're in single player campaign, any two-handed weapon bash will stun him pretty good. And with that, now for his relevance to Simon. The Saw Runner, which wears masks covering its head, which conceal its real face, could represent how Simon hides himself from others, and hides how he really feels. He tries to show himself to be normal, but in reality he's consumed by hatred and sadness, or alternatively the creature could represent an anxiety attack, as this thing is strong, fast, and can burst its way into your life at any moment. And ironically and fittingly, the best way to deal with the Saw Runner is the same as dealing with a panic attack, keeping calm and trying to remove yourself from the situation. And with that, that's the Saw Runner. Moving on to the next enemy, we have the Sumo. These enemies are found in the sewers first, but they'll continue to show up in dark and watery environments. The creature attacks by coming up to you and launching out a long tongue from its mouth, and the barbed wire wrapped around it can be broken from repeat strikes from a melee weapon, albeit it's not recommended to do this because they become faster and more powerful, so it's best you either hit them in the head or shoot them from a distance. Regarding their relevance to Simon, the way it attacks when caught up in its barbed wire could represent Simon's anger and bitterness by him lashing out verbally. Another interpretation is that the barbed wire represents a straitjacket, albeit this is useless as they can still attack with their heads, and cause Simon harm, like how Simon mentally torments himself. And that's all there really is to say about the sumo. Moving on to the next monster, we have the Stranger. These creatures appearing in TL Trading AB, the apartments and the asylum, albeit they're quite uncommon. When approached, they'll begin to attack you telepathically, rapidly dealing damage to you until they're killed. Once defeated, they let out an inhuman groan and begin to twitch and flicker before vanishing. Overall, tactics wise, it's best to just avoid them, when possible, due to the drain on health and ammo they can be, but if the player chooses to fight one or is forced to, it's advised you go at them with the hunting rifle or the M16, but ultimately they're best avoided. Regarding their relevance to Simon, they could represent how the book is starting to affect Simon himself and the harm it's causing him, albeit there's another layer to them. It's possible, given the name The Stranger, that when Simon sees people in the street, he's reading them like an open book in his mind, as Simon genuinely believes that a lot of people are saying nasty shit about him behind his back, so the creature's design may reflect this. And with that, that's surprisingly all there is to say about the Stranger. Now to move on to the next enemy, the Suicider. They're encountered in Saxon Avenue, the Asylum, the Subway and Kirkville. They are the only enemies aside from the Dr Purnell boss fight, who attacks with a firearm instead of a melee weapon. Combat wise, they will charge towards you with a Glock 19, rapidly firing at you inaccurately with zero care for their own self-preservation. Regarding tips for fighting them, firstly they're a good source of Glock ammo as they always drop their guns when killed. Secondly, once it runs out of ammo, it will shoot itself, eliminating itself as a threat. Thirdly, you can either face it in a gun battle, which its large head makes it easy to hit, or you can just close the distance, making the creature shoot itself instead. Fourthly, if the player does not have a Glock in their inventory, and picks one up from a suicider that killed itself, there's still going to be a bullet in the chamber, albeit you'll get a full magazine if the player already has a Glock. Fifthly, be careful on Nightmare mode as they can headshot you. And lastly, sixthly, in the co-op campaign Manhunt, they wield Ruger P345s instead of the standard Glocks. Relevancy to Simon wise, they represent his desire to end his own life. And that's pretty much all there is to him. And with that, moving on to the next enemy, the Taller. These monsters are a considerable threat, albeit exceedingly easy to avoid, primarily due to their slow speed, so you can pretty much just sprint past them without much trouble, and while it's possible to kill them, it's not advised, as it will consume a lot of time and ammo to take them down. As its name suggests, it is the tallest monster in the game. It's also advised you don't get close to them, as they can kill you with exceedingly little effort. They'll punch Simon if he gets too close, which will send you flying and onto the ground, at which point you'll be immobilized, and it will proceed to approach you while you're incapacitated and stomp on you, finishing you off. It is possible to get up after being hit, by either clicking the left mouse button or pressing the jump key, but all instances of the Taller can easily be avoided. However, should you choose to fight it, it's best to go with headshots, their enormous size and slow movement making it fairly easy. Even more so if you're using the hunting rifle. Despite the threat they can be, there's only 4 of them in the main campaign, 3 of them at the back of Waspet Gardens, accessed during the backtracking section, and 1 that randomly appears on the other side of the bus. Albeit in co-op, there is a shit zillion of these guys, spawning in Kirkville, the forest and the city in groups of 3 to 4 at the same time, and very often there's multiple spawns of them, but interestingly enough, if the player can lure a saw crazy towards them, it can defeat them rather easily. Anyway, in regards to their relevance to Simon, they could possibly represent a personified form of Simon's overwhelming depression. The damage it inflicts could also be related to this. It may also represent how Simon feels tiny, weak and pathetic in his wheelchair compared to those around him. He feels like everyone else is massive and towers over him, and that it would be incredibly easy for them to absolutely decimate him. The Taller could also represent the overwhelming size of the struggle within his own head, and the challenge of having to face his inner demons. And with that, that's the Taller. That completes the first row of monsters in the white category. We're 2/3 of the way through this, but let's not delay and let's keep going. Progressing straight on with Book Simon, he is the true final boss of Cry of Fear, faced if the player kills Carcass and trusts Dr Purnell with the gun in the asylum. Defeating him will unlock the 4th ending, the only ending which Simon doesn't kill himself. Regarding who Book Simon is the twisted version of the protagonist, silent and bloodied, who is very similar to The Addiction, the final boss of Afraid of Monsters, a game made by the same developers prior to Cry of Fear. But anyway, he attacks the player with various weapons, progressing throughout the fight depending on how much damage has been done to him. First with the Glock 19, then the Remington 870, followed by the MP9, and finally a sledgehammer, constantly running away when inflicted with enough damage, albeit when you fight him you play as the real Simon in his wheelchair, and it's revealed you was playing as Book Simon through the rest of the game, and you play as him in the 3 bad endings. But ultimately, Book Simon, armed with a flare and sledgehammer, is gunned down in a dark alley, and once killed it triggers the ending cutscene where Simon survives. In co-op mode however, sometimes the game will turn black and white, and the music from chapter 8 will begin to play. To get things back to normal, you have to track and kill Book Simon, who is armed with a shotgun, and although he seems perfectly real, and physically attempting to go after the real Simon to kill him, he was ultimately revealed to be nothing but a hallucination, albeit from the perspective of the real Simon, Book Simon was dead, which shows how Simon, despite being crippled and broken now mentally, managed to overcome this sickening wretched thing that was haunting him, and finally came to be at peace with himself. Regarding his relevance to Simon however, Book Simon is best described as the final culmination of all of Simon's psychological problems, his depression, anxiety, self-hatred, despair, suicidal feelings, and hatred towards everyone and everything, which are shown through the player choosing the darker paths, such as sparing Carcass or not trusting Purnell, as the Simon played throughout those endings, is the one we battle in the 4th. So in a super summary, Book Simon represents everything wrong with the real Simon. And with that, now to move on to the next monster. Next we have the boss Carcass, a boss fought at the end of chapter 3 in the rooftops, after Sophie's suicide. This creature attacks you by floating around, and shooting projectiles referred to as hook heads at the player. These projectiles tracking your movement and are difficult to dodge, which can make the boss rather difficult for some people, the hunting rifle being the best weapon for going against him. Once killed, he falls limp in his chair and the chair loses flight, falling to the ground below and vanishing. Choosing to stay and fight him, or fleeing to escape the fight, being a deciding factor in which ending you get, staying and killing him being necessary for ending 4, albeit it's worth noting that if you're going to fight him, his health goes up pretty drastically for each difficulty level, along with the amount of damage he does. Regarding his relevancy to Simon, he may be a symbol of Simon's grief, primarily in regards to his relationship with Sophie, Sophie's suicide before the boss fight, along with Carcass appearing directly after, and Sophie's fate if you choose not to fight him, all tying into this. But in regards to the very specifics of this idea, Carcass could represent how Simon's failing mental health, at least from his perspective, has killed his relationship with Sophie, Sophie's suicide representing her wanting no more of it. Or alternatively, the creature could represent Simon in his crippled state, and the grief associated with it, as Simon mentions that he's a sitting piece of meat on a chair, and the chains could represent how Simon feels as if he's tied down, due to his inability to walk. And that's pretty much it for Carcass. Moving on, the next boss we have to talk about is Craig, which is exclusive to the co-op campaign Manhunt, regarding the boss himself being hit by him as an instant kill, and he's very similar to the Sora boss, as many slowers will spawn during the fight. Craig can also be seen in the first chapter as the first boss of the campaign, instead of the regular Sora, albeit he's much easier to defeat. Regarding his relevance to Simon, the creature more or less embodies his guilt and self-loathing, Craig in particular, unlike the Sora, leaning more into the darker aspects, which is evident from the fact this thing is more mutilated, and is far more violent, wielding 2 chainsaws instead of 1. And with that, that's pretty much all there is for Craig. Moving on to our next boss, we have Mace, the second boss of the single player campaign, being found near the end of chapter 2 in the sewers. Mace appears after the book version of Dr Purnell has fled from Simon after beheading a man, whom he was torturing for the location of a key. As Mace appears, it reveals that it has the key and swallows it before the fight begins. Mace is notably very slow, and unable to see because of the bandages covering his eyes, often stopping for several moments to sniff around for Simon, before using his hearing to continue tracking him, as obviously moving through the partially flooded room is going to make sound that the creature can track. But despite its handicaps, the creature is completely immune to all damage, well, from your weapons at least. The only way to kill him is to turn up one of the 4 valves to power up his respective generator, which will prepare to emit a charge through the water in the partially flooded room, and you have to power up separate generators to generate enough charge to kill Mace, taking care to jump onto dry ground before the electricity can actually be emitted. The amount of generators needed to kill him depending on difficulty, albeit after he's killed his body still poses a problem due to the key he swallowed. This forces you to have to locate a nearby handsaw and cut your way into him, as to retrieve the key by hand. Regarding his relevance to Simon, considering how absolutely fucked up his body is, the creature could represent Simon's inner feelings of being broken, which is reflected by one of the endings. Or alternatively, due to the sheer force this thing can hit with, it could represent the actual car that crushed Simon, but overall, it represents the broken mess Simon has become. And with that, that's Mace. Moving on to the next creature, we have the Sora, the first boss you fight in single player, encountered in the apartment's nightmare sequence. The creature ambushes Simon when you enter its lair, by cutting a steam pipe blocking access to the door behind him, and then begin to pursue you relentlessly around the room, moving slowly but taking giant steps that allow him to keep pace with you. Being hit by him is an instant kill, so you need to keep your distance from him as he tries to close it, and you need to keep away from corners as to not get closed in. Sora himself is immune to all forms of damage, meaning you can't kill him directly. Instead, you need to damage him until he goes down on his knees, at which point an eye will emerge from his back, and that is his weak point. Albeit this damage only counts if the eye is open. The fight against him pretty much consists of downing him and then hitting this weak spot. Once defeated, however, he will succumb to the pain, fall to his knees and decapitate himself with his own chainsaw, finishing the fight and the chapter. Also, it's worth noting that his legs are immune to melee damage, meaning you can't bring him to his knees by hitting him in the legs with melee, albeit he takes twice as much damage if it's above his legs. So if you're able to land consistent melee strikes on his upper body somehow, he'll enter a stunned state much faster. This probably being so that if you're stuck with melee because you have no ammo, you actually have some form of chance against him. And the eye on his back takes the same amount of damage with each melee hit, regardless of what weapon is being used. And with that, now we can talk about its relevance to Simon. Unlike Craig, he could represent how Simon's inner fears and demons continue to pursue him, in a more general sense, as they continue to push him, and the way it kills Simon, by slicing him in half at the waist, could represent how Simon's legs were functionally cut off from the rest of his body, and that is what ultimately ends up killing him, if you let this thing be the thing that kills you. Albeit Simon doesn't literally lose his legs, this thing bifurcating you, if you manage to get killed by it, being more an exaggerated expression of this. And with that, that is the Sora. Now we can bring this video to its last part. That being Sick Simon, the final boss in all three of the bad endings. He's faced if you didn't kill Carcass or didn't trust Dr Purnell. He is at his core a manifestation of the real Simon who was crippled by the impact of the hit and run car, shown at the beginning of the game. Under instructions of Purnell, he began to write the book which leads to the events of the game, and creates the Simon you play as. Regarding the boss himself, after finishing the writing of the book in any of the bad endings, Simon shoots himself in the mouth and Book Simon, the protagonist, is sent to the nightmare world, his own mind. Realm blood-soaked and constantly changing, countless book pages with suicide written on it, Simon proceeds to make his way through the warped, twisted place, and eventually reaches where Sick Simon resides, a lingering depiction of what is left of the real Simon, attempting to fight away his evil twin. The symbolism of this fight itself is a depiction of Simon being ultimately overwhelmed and driven to kill himself. The actual fight against Sick Simon, however, can be exceedingly difficult for those who have no idea of what to do, as Simon will sit out of reach behind several steel bars, gunshots having no effect on him. He'll use psychic powers to throw items at the player, forcing you to jump and crouch over them. The player will also have to fight 4 waves of those unique faceless which were mentioned in part 1, each wave having one that has a valve for a head. The 4 valves being used to open up the gates to reach him. Upon finally raising the bars, Simon will enter the room and absolutely just pummel the shit out of the real Simon, until he goes unconscious and then strangles him to death. The death of Sick Simon results in Book Simon collapsing as well, the conclusion of the battle causing the real Simon to give in and kill himself, and as I said before, you play as Sick Simon in the 4th ending. And finally, covering his own relevance to himself, the area in which you battle him is unstable, constantly shifting and twisting, which could be symbolic of his mind completely collapsing, as at this point madness has completely consumed Simon, along with the sudden mood changes that come with it. This is also expressed by the books you have to climb on, and used as platforms, possibly correlating to how Book Simon is responsible for this, and how this depiction of himself has destroyed him, and the fact he's locked away behind bars could represent how Simon has locked himself away to write the book, isolating himself from everyone. It can also represent how the real Simon feels trapped and imprisoned in his own body. And with that, that is the final character, Sick Simon, and every other Cry of Fear monster. I'm gonna take a look at how long this recording is. Oh, it's already longer than the first part. You know what, before I wrap this up, I may do a video on Dr Purnell, and if I do a video on him, I'll shove Sophie and the apartment predator in there if I can. That reduces the amount of videos I need to make and it covers them as well. If I do, I don't know. But I'm gonna be honest, I'm kinda burned out with Cry of Fear. I've made 3 videos on it in a row. I literally recorded part 1 yesterday. No wait, it was the day before that. And I recorded a video on Simon the day before that, so I'm completely burned out with Cry of Fear. But yeah, I'm gonna wrap up this episode here. You might get a Purnell episode, you might not. Hope you enjoyed. Goodbye.